Welcome to the Unlist. Today we're going to be talking about fragrances that don't feel like they fit the overall style of the brand that released them. Fragrances that feel like they should have been released by another brand. Sometimes this is because the house in question has an overarching style that they maintain from release to release, or it could just be that a brand is known for many things but not the one thing that they put in that particular bottle, which makes it stand apart from all the other things that they've done. Whatever the case may be, when you smell a fragrance in question that feels like it doesn't really belong with the name on the box or the bottle that it gets, you're like, how is this a fragrance from this brand? It's an odd man out. It's a black sheep. It's whatever you want to call it. But we're going to discuss fragrances of that particular stripe in today's video. If you have any recommendations, as always, you can tell me in the comment section. If you disagree, you may also tell me politely in the comment section that you disagree. You know, I don't really like personal attacks and people making straw man arguments and doing anything they can to be right, because we're not here to be right. We're here to share. Sharing is more important than being right, okay? So, in my opinion. Now, we're going to start off with a brand that's pretty safely known to have an overarching house style. A brand that actually almost goes through pains to maintain a certain style that they've had since the very beginning. And that is House Chanel. Ever since number 5 came out back in 1921, over a century ago, they've always maintained a certain level of smoothness, no sharp edges, very sophisticated, very eminently wearable, sometimes boring though, right? Because their fragrances are so velveteen, so polished, almost to a fault. People who want edgy, who want exciting, extroverted, are really better off not looking into Chanel fragrances. That's what they want, right? Chanel is that sort of understated class. They've always had that understated class about them. But in 1981, when they finally followed up their first men's fragrance after 25 years, 1955 was when they released the first men's fragrance for Chanel. They didn't have another until 1981. That's a long time. That's actually 26 years. But once they did, it was this right here. Now, some may argue that this is still very much a Chanel fragrance because it is very polished, it is very smooth, and yes, you can argue those points. I can see where you're coming from, but on the whole, this is not a genteel, quiet, introverted, understated class kind of fragrance. Smooth it may be, refined it may be, but this is a big punch to the face with the castoreum, with the beeswax, styrax notes, the carnation, aldehydes and sour bergamot, the coriander in here. This is a big, bold, animalic, woody leather chypre that takes no prisoners. It is the power broker that is trying to make the deal of the century for the law firm or the company in question. It is that Patrick Bateman, Gordon Gekko, that ghoul in an Armani pinstripe suit, or in this case, maybe a Chanel suit. You get my point. That's who this fragrance was made for. That unapologetically sociopathic, Wall Street nightmare that was going to be in the Forbes, Fortune 500 before they hit the age of 30. That was the dream, to have the keys to the Lamborghini. Several Lamborghinis, in fact. So they have no time for empathy. They have no time for you, unless you're making them money, somehow. And it worked. I mean, that's what guys wanted in the early 80s. That's what they wanted. They wanted that powerful, urbanite sort of captains of the industry. The kind of thing that, ironically, Creed would try to court in later years, but that aesthetic really comes through with Antaeus. So as animalic as it is, as strong as it still feels like it is dressed to the nines. It's just dressed to the nines while also being like massively muscular and able to bench press your car while still wearing a suit. Okay, Chanel's never really gone there again. Yeah, they've had perhaps more daring fragrances like Egoist, and they have had fragrances that are risky and do other things, but none of them are just as aggressive. Nothing that Chanel has ever released before or since, at least not in the mainstream. Okay, they've got their exclusives and all that stuff, but their standard lines, nothing has ever smelled as aggressive as this. So that's why it doesn't feel very much like a Chanel fragrance, even though it technically is. Now, on the other hand, Dior is always known for being that rebel without a cause type of fragrance house. All of their early fragrances from Runitska were really experimental, really just, wearable pieces of art. Even the first one from Paul Vacher, Miss Dior, was a very big slap in the face fragrance. And even though some of their fragrances are lighter, like Eau Sauvage was a very light fragrance, albeit very daring, gender bendy with all the jasmine in the forefront. No matter how light their fragrances or heavy their fragrances are, all of Dior's fragrances have always been very contrarian, like I said, very rebellious. They don't want to be Chanel. They are the anti-Chanel. All the way up to the current day with Sauvage, right? Sauvage is just a nightmare to behold, but that's the point. However, way back in the late 90s, when Dior was having a bit of a downturn, I guess, they weren't doing as well as they had done in decades past. They kind of lost themselves. They released a very apologetic, very sort of toothless, beige carpet, white walls, that sort of thing. Just the complete opposite of what Dior is known for. A fragrance that honestly could have been released by Chanel. Which is why I said the shoe is on the other foot here. But Dune, Pour Homme by Christian Dior, released in 1996 or 7. I can't remember which. But late 90s. And this was a late coming addition to the Dune range because the women's Dune was released in 92. And while this fragrance doesn't have a whole lot of DNA in common with the women's Dune fragrance is very much a Dior fragrance. It is very challenging, very different, just like all the rest. Okay, but with Dune Pour Homme, I feel like they were just like, hey, we need a safe fragrance because everyone is doing safe fragrances. Calvin Klein sort of set the trend with that, with Eternity for Men back in '89. So all the men's releases throughout the 90s, with a few exceptions, were very safe, very clean, very minimalist. Apologetic is the word. And that is what you get here with Dune. You get a very apologetic, soft, woody, little bit of a fig leaf note in here. Not full-on fig like Philosopher's. This is not like Philosopher's. This is not a big fig fragrance. If you like big fig notes like Salvatore Ferragamo Pour Homme or Marc Jacobs for Men or anything along those lines, if you're looking for that, you're not going to get that with this. This is a very soft, smooth, quiet kind of a fragrance. It lasts a good long time, okay? It doesn't lack in the performance department, but you're just not going to get that reach out and grab it. It's not going to be that abracadabra, I'm going to reach out and grab you. It's not going to be that. You're not getting that from this. So, yeah, it just doesn't feel very Dior-like. because love or hate their fragrances from everything, like I said, going all the way back, fast forward all the way to now, even that really terrible Joy on the women's side that came out in 2016 or 17, even that really awful Joy fragrance was still very in your face. All their fragrances are pretty much in your face. This one is soft spoken, staring at its feet, you know, kind of like just sort of here in the corner. And it's just not very Dior like. And that's why this one is a black sheep for the brand. Next up, we are going to have a flanker. Much more recent release, much more modern release, but Acqua di Gio Absolu, 2017, I believe. Discontinued now as well, I believe. So part of me wonders if this wasn't a mod dump, because L'Oreal owns this brand, and L'Oreal doesn't like to waste R&D. So knowing that L'Oreal also is in control of a bunch of other brands, including YSL, they also have Prada now, and I believe Valentino as well. Part of me wonders if they were working on just a fragrance type for one of the other houses to compete more directly with what was popular in that era, which would have been Paco Rabanne Invictus, would have been Gucci Guilty, the original one, 2011, but that sweet, sort of slightly bubblegummy, rounded, clean, musky style of fragrance that just took over everything in the 2010s. Took over everything. And obviously, whatever fragrance was created with that brief got released for whichever house. If I were to really say which one, maybe the Born in Roma, Valentino Uomo Born in Roma. Maybe this was a mod from that. Hard to say for sure. But whatever the reason was, they wanted to make more money back from the money they spent. So they said, hey, you know what? We're going to dump this fragrance into the Acqua di Gio range. And that was a mistake. At the time, it may have sounded like a good idea. And what's really bizarre about this fragrance is they advertised this as a woody fragrance. The whole marketing behind this, which is why it has this wood cap on it, the whole marketing stratagem was, this is the woody Acqua di Gio. We're going to make the woody Acqua di Gio, which doesn't make sense because it's Acqua di Gio, not Silvestre di Gio, right, or whatever the Italian word for wood is, or pine. It's not Silvestre di Gio or di Gio Silvestre. It's Acqua di Gio, so it's, or Acqua Silvestre, I guess, right? It's not that, or Selva. It's not Selva di Gio. I don't know Italian, okay, guys? Help me out here. But they did it. They released this fragrance. And yeah, you can kind of see some woody traces in this a little bit, but it is very, very much that Invictus-y, Gucci Guilty, Urban Hero. Toomey has one called Awaken that's in the same vibe. So it just feels like it's that. That's slightly, again, bubblegummy a little bit, but also fresh, also clean, a little musky. And while I hate most of the copycats, I like Invictus. Okay, I like Invictus. I hate most of the other copycats. But I think this one is particularly refined because it's a bit spicier than all the rest. Again, a bit woodier. The wood cap has to be justified somehow. A bit woodier Typically, the whole Invictus vibe doesn't really have much by the way of wood, so put a little bit of wood in there, makes it a bit more interesting. But it just does not feel. It does not feel like an Acqua di Gio fragrance, and furthermore, it doesn't feel much like an Armani fragrance. More importantly than it being Acqua di Gio, it doesn't feel like an Armani fragrance either, because Armani, at least on the men's side of things, on the men's range, Armani typically does not go in this direction. They try to keep their fragrances in more of that. The Giorgio Armani stuff usually has a bit of a more of a classic Italian style. Acqua di Gio, very citrus. Okay, the Armani Code, very powdery, very sort of Tonka-ish with a bit more of a lavender spin. Now their Emporio Armani stuff is a bit more out there, because the Emporio range is like their clubbing nightclub sort of range. So the Emporio stuff, like Diamonds, like He, like Stronger With You, those are a bit more, again, a bit more all over the place, because that's the nightlife. That's the nightlife range. But the standard Giorgio Armani range is not really for the nightlife. It's for the black suit. Again, it's for the more buttoned up kind of guy. That's who wears the Giorgio Armani stuff, going all the way back to the originals with Armani and Armani Eau Pour Homme 82 and 84. So they've always kept that kind of, they've towed that line, right? So to have this sweet, youthful, just, again, doesn't really fit. And that's probably why it got discontinued. It didn't stay on the market very long, because they released it trying to capitalize. L'Oreal, the big mothership, trying to capitalize, but then they're like, nah, actually, we're sabotaging our brand image. At least with Giorgio Armani, they're sabotaging the brand image, and they pulled it from market. They had a very extra woody, like Absolute Instinct, that came out a year after this, and that stuff is just, even more, I could have picked that one, but I don't own that one, so, because that one's just horrible. Now, moving right along. Next fragrance that doesn't feel very much like it belongs into the house. I released it. This little guy right here. Doesn't get talked about very much either, by the way. In 2011, we saw the release of Encounter by Calvin Klein. I think it had Stellan Skarsgård was the actual face for this, which is kind of cool and unusual, because typically Calvin Klein doesn't really go for those sort of classical actors. All the Skarsgårds are really, really good actors. I know the youngest one played Pennywise, and he's probably branded for life with that role, but overall, this was a strange release. 2 reasons. One, not all, but most Calvin Klein fragrances, the men's are always a counterpart to the women's, with very few exceptions. The very first one, called Calvin, was not a counterpart to anything. And then, of course, when they came out with Crave in 2002, that was a special youth release. Wasn't a counterpart to anything either. But the other one, called Truth, was a men's version of another fragrance. So all the Calvin Kleins are usually, the men's releases are usually a counterpart to women's stuff. Now, that has changed with recent releases like Defy. Defy doesn't really doesn't have a women's version. Defy is just Defy. But for the longest time, up until Defy, the longest time, the vast majority of Calvin Klein fragrances were his counterpart to something else. The second thing that makes this weird is that it is a return to a more traditional structure. So most Calvin Klein fragrances, starting with Obsession, very futuristic, very polished, very avant-garde, okay? Some may say cyberpunk, some may say abstract. You'd be right in saying any of that. Obsession was basically an amber fragrance that someone ran through like a computer algorithm and just turned it into a perfect sphere of linalool and a bunch of other clean materials. Like, I describe it as if someone took a chunk of amber and polished it into a sphere, like waxed it, like Mother's California gold or whatever, and then made like a chrome ball of amber. Okay, it still smells like amber, it's still musky, but it's so clean, it's so polished, it's so removed from the source material that it just feels uncanny. And that's all of Calvin Klein's output. Very uncanny. Eternity for Men was a fougere, but so clean, so transparent, so crisp, so denatured, like denatured alcohol, so denatured of its original, from its point of origin. There you go, better choice of words. That carries on through with Escape, Abstract Melon Sandalwood, carries on through with Contradiction, Abstract Green, Truth, okay, Euphoria. We can just keep going. Okay, this is what Calvin Klein has always done. Its CK1 range is even more abstract and just out there, even though I love them all. Okay, I've got many of them. However, with this 2011, they decided to just go, you know what? Clean woody amber. That's it. Clean woody amber. That's what you get. You get a very pedestrian, very conventional woody amber profile. It's got a bit of lavender. It's polished up. It's clean. It's got a so-called oud note in it, but it's that medicinal M7 style of oud, so it doesn't really feel like oud for anyone who actually wears oud fragrances. It's just oud. I wouldn't call it an oud fragrance in the definition you're expecting, but it is just a very conventional woody amber fragrance, and it's kind of boring. You know, maybe it's a presage to Defy, because Defy was also very boring as well. I like some of the higher concentrations, but the original Eau de Toilette was very boring. So, no surprise that when this hit the market, people were like, next, because they've already smelled this. I mean, Bogart City Tower already did this. A bunch of other fragrances had already done this before this came around. So, I don't know if it was a mod they bought from someone. There's more like ingenuity in this packaging, very asymmetrical packaging, than there is in the fragrance itself. I think they spent more money on this bottle than they did on the perfume. Now, I like this. You can see how much I like it, though. I've worn it very little, so I must not like it all that much, but I still like it. But it just doesn't feel like a Calvin Klein fragrance to me. Not really. Not really. Another black sheep fragrance, I can say. Doesn't feel much like it belongs to the house in question. Some of you are going to come at me in the comments for this one, but I've got my backups for it. I've got my justification. It's going to be the highly lusted after, highly sought after, venerable, worshipped. I think I just put a bounty on my head by showing this on camera. Someone's going to find out where I live. and they're going to whack me, and they're going to take my perfumes. Because people go so fucking nuts over this. I understand why they go nuts over it. I like this too. I do. I like this too. But it doesn't feel like an Yves Saint Laurent fragrance. It really doesn't. And the thing is, they've had other fougères, right? They've had Jazz before this. Jazz had a flanker, Jazz Prestige. We also had the Opium Pour Homme release, which was kind of a more of a semi-oriental fougère take. But they did that already, okay? And with Jazz, the point of Jazz was to be a counterpoint to Kouros, because Kouros was very animalic, very daring, okay? Jazz was meant to be more safe, more discreet, more sophisticated. They were trying to bring back the original fougère style from the early 20th century, come full circle with that, basically, with Jazz. And they chose that because Zino Davidoff was doing fairly well, and fougères in general were coming back around, being sort of deconstructed and becoming more old school again, moving away from the years of aromatic embellishment they had. But this wasn't in the late 80s. This was 2003. And really, knowing what I know about this fragrance now, knowing the creative director who was Tom Ford, this just feels like a Tom Ford fragrance to me. But without the Tom Ford price, right? Without that. Because these were not $400 when they first came out. They might be $400 now, but they weren't $400 when they first came out. They were like maybe $85, $90, and then discounted $30, $40 all day, every day. And for a men's version of a very futuristic, at the time, 1971, metallic rose perfume, it's very sheer, futuristic. You would think if you're going to make a men's version of that, Michael High, Jacques Polge before he joined Chanel, they did a very futuristic, very chic rose fragrance in the 70s. You'd think if you were going to make a men's version of that, you would try to stay somewhere in that ballpark, because Opium Pour Homme was still basically an oriental fragrance, so it had some tie back to the original Opium from 77. This has no relation at all. No relation at all to Rive Gauche. And again, I love this fragrance, but what this smells like to me, this smells like a love letter to Azzaro and Barbasol. Maybe a dash of like this. I don't know if Tom Ford knows about Orland, the brand Orland, but a little bit of this too. So a little bit of Derek, my namesake fragrance, a little bit of Derek, a little bit of Barbasol shave cream, red and white can, and a big old glob of Azzaro. So I'm just trying to get in the head of Tom Ford. And he's like, I wanted a shaving cream fragrance that felt like my favorite Azzaro. Again, splash of Derek maybe. But that's not very Yves Saint Laurent at all. So all of his fragrances up until that point had made really big statements. Jazz at the time was risky because everyone was making musky powerhouse fragrances. Everyone was making aquatics, fresh fragrances. Nobody was making classic fougères. So to put out a very classic fougère in the late 80s was a big risk compared to what everything else was. But in 2002, 2003, fragrance like this wasn't so risky, really, because we had a bunch of fragrances already on the market like this. So, granted, some of them were older fragrances, but fougères, ever since their resurgence, had kind of remained sort of perennial. It wouldn't really be until Aventus, Bleu de Chanel, stuff like that, killed off the fougère. right? We had Sartorial, we had Parfums, MDCI, Invasion Barbare. We had a bunch of Fougere revival fragrances all throughout the 80s, the 90s, 2000s. So there wasn't anything particularly YSL-ish about this. It just doesn't feel like it belongs with the rest. Even M7 after this, or before this. M7 before this was so much just bolder and different. And then L'Homme in 2006, very fruity, very kind of metrosexual was the term they used then. Very gender bendy. L'Homme was very gender bendy. La Nuit de l'Homme, you know, those were also just more, like I said, more stepping out. This one was just, I feel like this was more of a pet project for Tom Ford. And you have nowhere further to look than later on down the road when he would make Fougère d'Argent, right, in the private line, and Beau de Jour also in the private line, which would become a standard fragrance. So, yeah, this was really more like a prologue to what Tom Ford would later do with his own brand, right here in this bottle. Didn't feel like a YSL fragrance. Now, no one in 2003 knew that this was going to resurface in Tom Ford's own house because he didn't have his own house then. It's not my point. Hindsight is a little more, you know, you get what I'm saying, right? But yeah, of all of the YSL fragrances I have, this one doesn't feel like it belongs. And I still love it. And no, you can't have my bottle. No, you can't make me an offer. Fuck off. But just got to point it out there. Doesn't really feel like a YSL to me. Feels like its own little dreamland kind of thing. It's fantastic though, and I love it, but doesn't feel like it sits alongside the rest. So there you guys have it. Those are fragrances released by brands that don't really feel like they belong with the house. I can do more. If you want a part 2 of this, let me know. I can keep going, but I'm running out of time, and you don't want to watch a video longer than 30 minutes anyway. That's what YouTube says. So I'm going to leave it off here. Thanks for watching.